Night at Villa Diodati in the summer of 1816 is quiet in the way that long conversation makes a place quiet, the talk moving from one small topic to another while the hour slips forward. George Gordon Byron is present. Mary and Percy Shelley are present. Claire Claremont is present, and John William Polidori sits with them, listening and taking in details that will not feel important until later. He keeps notes. He writes fragments. And some of those fragments become a short tale that appears in print 3 years later, under circumstances that will make the tale read very differently from how it was first told. The printed item of 1819 carries a name that matters more than the text, and the association changes how readers and reviewers understand what they read. That extra name brings attention, and attention becomes part of the story the public tells about the text. The result is not simply literary, it is social. Reputation shifts, letters circulate, and a brief piece of fiction is read as evidence of something larger than its plot. Move forward to 1872 and a different setting, an Irish household described in plain domestic detail where Sheridan Le Fanu places a narrative that unfolds through framed documents and testimony. Carmilla keeps its focus on the small room, the slow rhythms of daily life, and the close company of two women. And that focus makes the strange elements feel immediate and unavoidable. The story does not rely on spectacle. It relies on proximity and on the way private testimony can seem authoritative. Both the Vampyre and Carmilla use everyday forms and plain description to make certain kinds of intimacy legible. Both appear in periodical contexts that insert editors, printers, and readers between author and audience, and those intermediaries shape first responses. The circulation of texts, the choices made by publishers, and the social assumptions readers bring to the pages all combine to turn private accounts into public objects of concern. The question at the center of this journey is straightforward. How did late-night conversation, editorial choice, and the routines of the periodical market combine to produce a figure readers began to read as a social threat? John William Polidori arrived at Geneva in the summer of 1816 with clear, practical aims. He was 21, trained in medicine, and recently appointed as Lord Byron's companion and physician. He understood the value of connection and the limits of credit earned by training alone. The household positions and introductions he could secure mattered for future income and for the possibility of building a literary name. He moved among people who read widely and talked often, and he paid attention to how conversation produced reputations in ways that formal publication sometimes could not. Polidori observed the group at close range. He sat for long hours, heard repeated jokes and complaints, and noticed the tones that returned to signal serious feeling beneath casual speech. He recorded details in notebooks with an attentiveness shaped by clinical practice. That habit of observation shows in the way he later structured narrative material. He attended to symptoms and signs in people, and he could translate that attention into a compact narrative register that asked readers to treat certain scenes as credible testimony rather than as pure fantasy. The Villa Diodati evenings have been told many times in compressed form. The neat version, in which a single night yields a finished tale, is a story easy to tell and easy to remember. The fuller account shows a sequence of impulses, drafts, and editorial calculations. Conversation supplied imagery, and a mood of challenge. Memory supplied fragments, later assembled. Polidori revised and reshaped material across weeks and months. He knew the periodical market, and he composed with awareness of the brief, pointed form that magazine readers favored. The story that emerged places its strange elements in settings familiar to the intended readers. Interiors, guest lists, invitations, and polite conversation appear with the kind of precision that lets a contemporary reader map the narrative onto social space. The figure at the center is not remote. He is an urbane intruder who exploits status and taste to gain access and advantage. That emphasis shifts the sense of threat away from rural superstition and toward the slow social erosion of trust within respectable households. Polidori is both a participant in and a recorder of the social world he depicts. He was not a neutral eye. He had obligations and ambitions. He sought a publisher, he sought remuneration, and he sought the status that came from being recognized as an author in a competitive London scene. The choices he made while drafting and revising reflect those practical concerns. He adapted tone and emphasis in order to make a concise effect, appropriate for a magazine audience and for potential theatrical adaptation. Publication practice in the period magnified the consequences of attribution. Editors and printers were active agents in framing copy. When a tale could plausibly be connected with a well-known figure, an editor might emphasize that connection because publicity translated into sales. In the 1819 context, a periodical that suggested a link with Byron could expect attention from readers and reviewers who followed his name. Once a public association formed, the mechanics of correction worked slowly. The initial impression tended to persist in correspondence and in the reviews that followed. Polidori responded to the published record in ways shaped by those commercial and reputational pressures. He published clarifying notices and he prepared editions that emphasized his authorship. Those steps are visible in correspondence and in later prefatory materials. The effort to correct the public record shows how precarious authorial control could be in a market oriented toward novelty and celebrity. For a young writer with limited financial security, losing clear claim to a piece could mean lost opportunities for patronage or for paid commissions. Critical reaction mixed aesthetic remarks with social concern. Some reviewers treated the tale as a compact and effective piece of imaginative writing suited to readers who wanted sensation in small doses. Others read it as evidence of dangerous taste, a symptom of moral decline among classes that should set a better example. The figure in the tale was useful for critics who wanted to talk about seduction and about the risks that accompany unregulated intimacy in elite circles. That use of the story shows how fiction and public anxiety commonly cross-reference one another in period discourse. Polidori brought a clinically inflected sensibility to description. The narrative emphasizes physical signs, sleep disturbance, pallor, and other bodily indicators. The medical register contributes to the plausibility of the account and gives readers a vocabulary through which to interpret intimate contact as pathological or as morally significant. In an era when medical language carried social authority, this register permitted moral and diagnostic readings to circulate with rhetorical force. Personal relations inside the circle influenced later recollections of the events. Rivalries and resentments appear in letters and memoirs, and those documents show that participants often remembered episodes in ways that served later claims. Memory is not transparent, and published recollections should be read with caution. Polidori attempted to correct the record in print and in private correspondence, and those attempts themselves became part of the documentary trail scholars now consult. The text that circulated in 1819 shows variant versions and a tangled attribution history. Printer sheets, periodical files, and publisher correspondence reveal that multiple hands intervened in presentation. Some copies emphasized a link to a famous name. Other copies corrected the attribution or printed notes that clarified authorship. The unevenness of the record is instructive. It demonstrates how a story can acquire public identity during the course of editorial handling rather than solely through private authorial intention. The social figure that readers fastened on in the tale is characterized by charm, social mobility, and a capacity to conceal intent behind a polished surface. Those features made the character useful for readers interested in the social effects of privilege. The character's success in avoiding legal or reputational consequence resonated with anxieties about how inherited status could shield wrongdoing. Readers could therefore treat the tale as a veiled commentary on elite behavior without needing explicit naming. Short fiction of the period was inherently portable. Its compact form made performance and adaptation practical. The character created in Polidori is economical. Essential traits are concentrated so that theatrical versions could amplify gesture and spectacle while preserving the social logic of the original narrative. Stage adaptations brought the figure to new publics and helped to fix certain traits as recognizable markers of literary vampirism. Biographical context matters to interpretation. Polidori struggled to convert access into sustainable success. He edited, he wrote reviews, and he sought commissions. The difficulties he faced in professional life affected how he positioned claims about authorship and how he responded to reviews. Later, scholarly accounts that try to extract a single origin for the figure risk overlook in the economic and personal contingencies that inform any literary career. Polidori is useful to study because he stands at the crossroads of clinical practice, literary ambition, and social participation. Letters and documentary evidence permit reconstruction of stages in composition and publication. Draft fragments show revision and shifting emphasis. Correspondence with publishers, with acquaintances, reveals attempts to place work and to correct public impressions. Printer ledgers and issue contents allow precise dating of public appearances. Taken together, these sources show a multi-stage process in which conversation supplied material that was then mediated by authorial shaping and by the commercial logic of the press. Reception practice in Britain and on the continent shaped how readers and reviewers took up the tale. Newspapers and journals amplified impressions by repeating attributions and summarizing narrative material for their own readers. Private letters circulated opinions that further entrenched certain readings. Once a public frame formed, the narrative acquired a life independent of the precise steps that produced it, and that independent life influenced subsequent reprints and adaptations. The case also illuminates questions about how social anxieties are translated into literary form. The vampire figure in Polidori is effectively a model for discussing predation enacted through social advantage. The narrative registers behavior rather than offering sustained supernatural explanation. Readers looking for a moral argumentative frame, could use the tale to discuss consent, vulnerability, and the limits of polite society. That instrumental use of fiction helps to explain why a concise narrative could have an impact beyond the scale expected for a single magazine item. The textual and social history of the tale underscores the role of intermediaries in literary formation. Editors, printers, reviewers, and even readers act as agents in the production of meaning. Attribution practices and marketing choices are not neutral. They affect careers and they affect interpretation. Polidori is bound to the story in part by what he contributed, and in part by what others did with the text after it left his hands. Later adaptation and reuse of the figure built on the core features that made the original tale resonant. The traits of social mobility, performative charm, and intimate intrusion offered later writers a template that could be intensified or inverted. That adaptability is one reason the figure persisted and migrated into other cultural forms. Polidori's life and the story he produced together show how a small piece of fiction can become a node for broader cultural debate. The process involves individual agency, editorial mediation, market pressure, and social anxiety. The printed tale that readers encountered in 1819 carried traces of those operations. Its subsequent circulation and adaptation made the figure into a more durable cultural tool. A short tale appeared in a London periodical in 1819, and it quickly became a point of public dispute. The printed item carried an attribution that many readers took to mean the work belonged to a famous poet. That initial attribution mattered. It shaped how reviewers and correspondents read the text, and it decided how the story moved through the public sphere. Attribution in that moment was not a neutral bibliographic footnote. It was a social fact that carried authority, curiosity, and market value. The immediate problem began with how the tale entered print and how the printed page was read. Oral memory, private recollection, and editorial handling all played a role. People who had been present at late-night conversations near Geneva recalled stories and fragments, but memories differed about who had finished a polished tale and who had merely told an anecdote. The movement from spoken remark to published narrative required shaping. A small number of drafts, corrections, and decisions then entered a commercial press environment that rewarded novelty, rumor, and the promise of celebrity association. In that environment, a single printed line that hinted at a famous name could have outsized consequences. Polidori's attempts to correct the public record are part of the documentary trail. He produced versions and statements in which he sought to reclaim credit. He wrote letters, he prepared reprints, and he insisted privately to friends that the finished tale was his. Those moves had practical motivation. Authorship translated into professional possibility. In a literary market where introductions and reputation open doors, having a readable claim to a popular tale could affect income and future prospects. That practical pressure helps to explain the tenacity of the dispute. Editors and compositors were not neutral transmitters of text. The production process dispersed control across hands. An editor made decisions about headlines and presentation. A compositor set type under pressure and sometimes introduced or preserved typographical quirks. A publisher judged promotional choices. When a periodical suggested a connection with a public figure, the decision was both a marketing choice and an interpretive move. Highlighting a potential association would increase a Title S circulation. That commercial incentive meant that an initial framing could harden into public memory before any full correction could be widely circulated. Contemporary readers responded by treating the attribution as a lens for interpretation. If a piece was thought to come from a celebrated poet, then style, theme, and assumed politics became tools for reviewers and letter writers. Critics compared lines of diction and felt them to accord or not accord with the supposed author. Those stylistic comparisons are not proof of origin, but they matter because public taste used them to allocate praise or blame. A narrative read through the prestige of a famous name acquired a different public life than the same narrative read as the work of an early career writer. Textual variants complicated the matter. Multiple printed forms circulated during the months after the tale first appeared. Some versions included prefatory notes that attempted to clarify provenance. Others preserved the original presentation that suggested celebrity authorship. Differences in punctuation and phrasing cross issues and reprints allowed commentators to point to stylistic disparities as if those disparities definitively identified an author. That kind of argument is fragile, but it mattered in debates that mixed aesthetic judgment with social concern. Private letters and memoirs became key evidence in contested claims. Participants in the social circle and acquaintances later published recollections and private notes. Those documents often contradict one another. Memory is shaped by interest. Some recollections sought to protect reputations. Others sought to settle old grievances. The archive, therefore, offers multiple, sometimes incompatible voices. Reading it requires attention to motive as well as to content. Even when testimony is partial or self-serving, it is valuable because it shows how contemporaries understood the relation between conversation draft and finished text. Polidori's professional situation matters to understanding the dispute. He had responsibilities that included service to a household, and he attempted to secure a public literary foothold. The ambiguous reception of the tale produced immediate consequences. For an emerging writer, losing clear authorship meant losing potential commissions and introductions that could sustain a career. The social economy of letters at the time made authorship a resource that could be deployed or withdrawn by public perception. The struggle to control the narrative of origin, therefore, has to be read as a practical fight over livelihood, as well as over credit. Critical reaction ranged from the mildly appreciative to the alarmed. Some reviewers praised the tale as effective short fiction suited to magazine readers. Others treated it as morally dubious or symptomatic of a loosened taste. Those moral criticisms often referenced the supposed author as if his identity justified a wider cultural judgment. When attribution suggested a certain public persona, critics used the text to argue about that persona. When attribution pointed to a lesser figure, critics used it to frame the piece as imitation or ambition uncontrolled by discretion. The dispute over who wrote the tale therefore structured wider moral conversation. Legal and commercial pressures also shaped responses. Publishers worried about libel and about offending subscribers. The risk of litigation or of alienating influential readers encouraged cautious correction when controversy arose. But commercial inertia meant that first impressions endured. Periodicals circulates in networks of reprint and review that amplified initial presentation. A correction published late in an annual issue would not erase the impressions formed by months of discussion and reprinting. The economics of periodical publishing thus contributed to the longevity of a misattribution even after later attempts at clarification. The tale itself lent material to the interpretive frames that critics offered. The central figure is composed as an urbane intruder, someone who uses manners and social competence to enter households and to manipulate affection. That depiction encouraged readings that linked the character with aristocratic excess and with predation that looked like charm. Readers predisposed to anxiety about elite behavior could readily translate narrative detail into social critique. The misattribution to a prominent public figure made that translation easier. The narrative became an occasion to speak about broader social dangers by way of a single text. Scholarship in later years has drawn on the surviving manuscript fragments, on printers' ledgers, and on correspondence to reconstruct likely sequences. These documents show revision and negotiation. Draft material reveals that the story changed as it moved from private note into a printed object. Publisher records and issue contents allow dating of different presentations and show where corrections were printed. The presence of variant forms is evidence of a publication process that was iterative and distributed rather than instantaneous and singular. Adaptation to other media complicated afterlife. Theatrical managers and later dramatists found in the tale a compact figure and a convenient plot. On stage, the character could be emphasized and made physically vivid. Stage adaptations often further detached the figure from the original authorial intention and allowed producers to exploit celebrity association to sell tickets. Once theatrical versions circulated, the public memory of the story fused with performance tradition as well as with print citation. That multiplicity of channels made the authorial question even harder to settle in the popular mind. Polidori's attempts to correct the public record included publication of later editions and direct statements. That effort shows both determination and vulnerability. He pursued recognition because the stakes were tangible. Later readers who search the archive will find those assertions recorded alongside reviews and private letters. The patchwork of sources demonstrates that authorial identity in a commercial periodical system is contested, and that it can be shaped as much by the actions of editors and publishers as by the actions of the writer. The controversy over origin also reveals something about how authority operated in early 19th century literary culture. A name on a page could act as a credential. Readers and reviewers use that credential to map meaning. At the same time, name-based credentialing could be manufactured or misapplied. The production chain of print culture from manuscript to compositor to issue made room for both error and for deliberate framing. Understanding the dispute, therefore, requires attending to the material practices of publication as well as to the social relations that motivated claims. The lasting effect of the misattribution is visible in how the tale was read and used in subsequent decades. Even when scholars correct a record, popular associations persist. Theater programs, anthologies, and casual references continued for a long time to link the tale with a famous name. That persistent misreading shaped the tale-esque role in public culture. It gave the story a visibility it might not otherwise have had, and it shaped how later writers thought about the figure as portable and marketable. Finally, the authorship controversy matters because it changed what readers thought a short tale could do. The dispute made it clear that fiction could participate in public argument about reputation, taste, and privilege. A short magazine story was not merely entertainment. It could be a node in networks of influence and accusation. The interplay of oral memory, private correspondence, editorial decision-making, and market incentives therefore produced a complex textual history in which authorship itself became part of the narrative that readers consumed. The move from late-night conversation into regular print did not happen all at once. It unfolded across decades as reading habits, publishing practices, and public language changed. Between the 1820s and the 1860s, the market for magazines and newspapers expanded steadily. More people read on a regular basis. Urban populations grew. Rail and postal networks made the circulation of periodicals faster and more predictable. These shifts shortened the gap between private talk and public text. A story told in a salon or a villa could reach a national reading public far more quickly than one generation earlier. And that change created new incentives for writers and editors. Editors developed formats that catered to habitual readers. Regular columns, fixed departments, and recurring fiction slots made certain kind of short narrative especially useful. Readers who bought a monthly or weekly title expected material that rewarded attention across issues. Short-frame narratives, first-person testimony, and tightly plotted sketches fit that demand. They were quick to read, easy to reprint, and well-suited to serial presentation when editors wanted to extend interest. The periodical format therefore shaped the kind of stories that circulated most widely. It favored concision, plausibility, and a sense that what was told might be evidence rather than mere invention. Serialization changed how narratives were composed and received. When a tale could appear in parts, writers and editors adjusted structure and pacing to fit gaps between installments. Episodes had to hold attention and also build a sense of accumulating testimony. Framed documents and reported diaries adapted well to that rhythm, because each published fragment could function as a piece of evidence while contributing to a larger shape. The serialized environment encouraged authors to use the apparent authority of documents as a device. Readers who followed an installment sequence came to expect that revelations would be supported by fragments of record rather than by omniscient narration. That audience expectation favored the testimonial and archival modes that later Gothic writers exploited. Market pressures shaped what could be said and how it could be said. Publishers were businesses that relied on subscriptions and advertiser trust. Libel law and concerns about public morality made many editors cautious. Open depictions of sexual transgression, explicit accusations against named individuals, and graphic detail threatened legal or commercial consequences. The solution adopted by many editors and writers was implication. Writers learned to signal transgression through symptoms, through clinical terms, or through the grammar of testimonial evidence. That approach allowed sensitive topics to be addressed while reducing the risk of overt censorship or litigation. At the same time, medical language moved into ordinary conversation in new ways. popular medical manuals, advice columns, and widely available casebooks familiarized a general reading public with diagnostic terms. References to pallor, to protracted sleep, to wasting strength, and to altered appetite could be deployed by a writer to indicate serious disturbance without needing to specify cause. The medical register gave an aura of authority. It also created a mechanism for converting private contact into observable sign. A doctor consulted in a story provided a plausible public anchor for what otherwise would be private rumor. That procedural turn made testimonial modes more persuasive to readers who trusted clinical vocabulary. The domestic interior became a prime location for uncanny effect. As towns and cities expanded, household boundaries became more complex and more vulnerable. Servants, visitors, and networks of kin made private spaces porous in ways that provoked anxiety. The Gothic move of placing threat inside a home appealed to middle-class readers who worried about privacy, reputation, and inheritance. A figure who entered a household under polite pretense and who then influenced family life represented a clearly readable danger. That shift from remote landscape to domestic setting changed the scale and tone of horror. Threat became social and intimate rather than remote and supernatural in the old sense. Genre boundaries loosened in the periodical ecology. Melodrama, sensation fiction, legal narrative, and Gothic atmosphere were blended in compact pieces. Melodrama taught economical presentation of intense emotion. Sensation fiction contributed plots in which private secrets had public consequences. Legal style supplied procedural detail and a register of official authority. Gothic language brought motifs of recurrence, inheritance, and uncanny resemblance. Short fiction of the middle decades often combined these elements, and that hybridity allowed writers to produce immediate emotional effect while maintaining plausible, documentable structures. Critics and reviewers also developed more systematic ways of placing short pieces within literary lineages. A review that linked a tale to a fashionable name could raise interest and influence reception. Writers and publishers learned to anticipate critical framing. The prospect of favorable comparison encouraged certain compositional choices. A piece that could be described as mysterious and exemplary in a review had added market value. Critics thus participated in a feedback loop that shaped how authors wrote and how readers interpreted texts. Caution about libel and morality pushed rhetoric toward suggestion. Editors preferred material that left room for interpretation rather than that required explicit accusation. That preference created a culture in which readers learned to read symptoms and small domestic disturbances as signs of deeper wrongdoing. A brief pattern of behavior could be enough for a reader to infer motive. The vampire figure fit well into this logic because the pattern of intimate contact, bodily change, and unexplained influence could be presented as clinical observation or as fragmentary testimony without explicit sexual or moral labeling. Dramatic adaptation extended the reach of magazine fiction. Theaters looked for compact plots with vivid character types that could be expanded into stage action. A short tale focusing on manner, social entry, and household tension supplied ready material. Stage versions amplified physical gesture and spectacle, and so emphasized aspects of character that print left more ambiguous. Once a figure appeared on stage, certain traits became fixed in public memory. Theater, and later visual media, helped cement recognizable features that writers and adapters could later draw on or modify. Regional and cultural variation also affected how Gothic material was received. In some areas, explicit supernatural claim remained plausible and profitable. In other contexts, a more domestic, ambiguous reading was preferred. British periodical culture often allowed a story to be read either as clever fiction or as a report of an odd incident, depending on reader inclination. The effectiveness of framed testimony rested on that flexibility. It permitted different audiences to derive different satisfactions while preserving a wide market appeal. Narrative voice moved increasingly toward interior and testimonial modes. First-person narration invites reader proximity and the sense of eyewitness account. Framing devices such as letters, memoirs, and depositions suggested documentary authority. Those modes position the reader as interpreter or as witness. Whether a reader accepted the documents as proof or as rhetorical performance, the testimonial form produced immediacy and a sense of consequence suitable to domestic unease. By the middle and later decades of the century, the publishing ecology had become familiar with these tactics. Editors knew which formal moves produced plausible suggestion and which commercial strategies enlarged circulation. Authors who worked in the testimonial and domestic Gothic registers found an audience ready to translate intimacies into public significance. The vampire figure adapted to this environment because it could function without explicit naming of desire. A pattern of intimate contact, progressive bodily change, and unexplained influence provided enough evidence for the reading public to infer transgression in social terms. This transition is not only technological and commercial, it is also cultural. The romantic focus on dramatic personality and landscape gave way in many popular works to interest in the small, persistent unease of domestic invasion. The vampire, as a modern literary figure, became a tool for exploring anxieties about social order, gender, and the permeability of private space. That development set the stage for writers who would place intimate transgression at the center of narrative and use documentary framing to make it readable without explicit declaration. Sheridan Le Fan's position in 19th century letters is practical to state and important for reading Carmilla. He writes within an Irish context shaped by local politics, denominational divisions, and a lively periodical marketplace. He publishes in the 1860s and 1870s when readers know the conventions of framed testimony, and when magazines seek compact pieces that can be reprinted and adapted. Carmilla appears in a Glass Darkly in 1872. The story is short and tightly organized. It uses a documentary frame, a domestic setting, and restrained detail to produce a steady accumulation of unease rather than a sudden shock. The narrative frame gives the account a documentary posture. The story presents a set of papers and a deposition gathered after the events. The narrator claims to assemble testimony and to provide dates and names. That apparatus invites readers to behave like interpreters of evidence, rather than like casual admirers of spectacle. The frame is not theatrical. It serves as a device that permits the narrator to record intimate scenes without moralizing, and it permits readers to infer what is left unsaid. The textual strategy is deliberate. By presenting the material as recovered documentation, Le Fanu increases its apparent credibility while preserving ambiguity. The domestic scene is simple in description and complex in effect. The house is remote enough to be private, but it is not an isolated ruin or a haunted castle. It is a home with a routine and with expectations of propriety. Daily rhythms, such as meals and visits, structure the narrative. Small discrepancies in routine are the first signals of change. A servant reports a strange behavior. A child sleeps badly. A guest arrives who seems both familiar and foreign. The accumulation of small domestic facts makes the disruption readable in everyday terms. The effect is unsettling because the home is supposed to be secure. The narrative shows how routines provide the baseline against which anomalies register. Carmilla, as character, is written with restraint. She arrives as a guest and she stays. She performs ordinary acts of tenderness and attention. She is companionable. The narrator observes physical details carefully, a certain complexion, a way of reclining, a propensity to prefer certain hours. Those details are never melodramatic. They're descriptive and specific. By concentrating on proximate behavior rather than on sensational claim, Fanu asks readers to notice pattern rather than to be shocked by isolated act. The slow accumulation of behavioral detail creates interpretive pressure. Readers begin to sense a structure of intimacy that has ethical and social consequence without any explicit naming. The relation between the narrator and Carmilla is prolonged and intimate. The scenes of shared leisure, of conversation late into the evening, and of small acts of care occupy narrative time. Fanu does not describe these scenes with lurid language. The language is even and measured. That measured register amplifies effect because it forces attention into the space where emotion is felt rather than where it is declared. The emotional intensity is present through lingered description, through gestures repeated in different scenes, and through the narrator's fixation on particular moments. The cumulative result is a sense of attachment that becomes troubling because it appears to change the household's moral and physical equilibrium. Gender shapes the politics of that intimacy. Two women at close quarters in a private household disturb the expected script of Victorian domestic relations. The narrative locates the intensity within female friendship and guardianship. The household hierarchy assumes certain types of affection and care. The narrator expects protectiveness and maternal authority. Carmilla's presence complicates those expectations by creating a bond that blurs caregiving and desire. The effect is not explicit sexuality rendered bluntly. It is a reconfiguration of attachment that makes the household vulnerable, because the traditional guardianship roles fail to contain the attachment's consequences. Fanu uses medical and testimonial registers to make suggestion plausible. A physician is consulted. Observations are recorded. Tests are performed. That procedural material appears as documentation inside the narrative frame. The medical register supplies a vocabulary that can signal disturbance without naming desire. Pallor, wasting, sleep disturbance, interrupted appetite, and other signs form an ensemble that readers familiar with clinical language can read as evidence. The testimonial tone makes the medical notes feel less like an intervention and more like part of a public file that the narrator compiles. The procedure converts private impression into quasi-public proof. Temporality in the narrative is organized to build cumulative certainty while preserving doubt. Events are reconstructed in sequence through dated notes and memory. The frame limits the narrator's omniscient authority by insisting on partial documentation. The result is that revelation unfolds through the interrelation of separate documents, rather than through a single confident voice. The gaps between papers become interpretive spaces where readers fill in inference. That structural choice keeps the tone sober and makes the final disclosures appear grounded in assembled witness rather than in rhetorical flourish. Ambiguity is a formal goal. Carmilla is a figure who resists simple moral classification. She is at once alluring and threatening. She is a source of comfort and of harm. Fanu resists assigning a univocal motive. The narrator experiences sympathy and fear. The narrative's refusal to reduce Carmilla to a stereotype increases the psychological intensity of the account because it forces readers to sit with a conflicted, affective field. Sympathy and alarm coexist, and the text requires readers to hold both responses without closure until evidence accumulates. Textual technique is meticulous. Fanu repeats certain motifs and phrases so that small details accrete meaning. A gesture described once reappears later in a new context. A bodily symptom noted early returns to signal escalation. Reported speech and deposition fragments stage slightly different perspectives that sometimes contradict one another. The effect imitates how real testimony behaves. Real witnesses differ in detail and emphasis. Fanu uses that feature to deliver a convincing sense of documentary complexity. The repeated elements function as signposts that guide interpretation without forcing it. The household's social ecology is central. The narrative includes servants, a guardian figure, and local acquaintances. Each contributes to the evidence. Servants overhear fragments. A doctor notes physiological change. A guardian, who is also a social actor, must consider reputation and inheritance. The multiplicity of perspectives makes the event not merely private disturbance, but a matter that has social consequences. The household's concern for propriety and future stability shapes how evidence is collected and how confession is pursued. Reputation and social standing are practical stakes in the narrative's unfolding. Fanu's language for intimacy is coded. He cannot rely on explicit lexicon to describe erotic attachment. He uses touch, lingering presence, comparative devotion, and a lexicon of attention to indicate what he cannot declare. Contemporary readers with certain anxieties read those signs as erotic or improper. Other readers could interpret the same behavior as intense friendship or as misguided devotion. The dual potentialities are central to the narrative because they allow the text to function in multiple registers and to be read by different audiences with different interpretive frames. The vampire motif operates as both symbol and mechanism. In Carmilla, the figure is not an isolated folkloric monster. The vampire is a social intruder who functions through intimacy, not through conspicuous brutality. The danger lies in the ease of access to private spaces and in the capacity to convert attachment into harm. That model ties vampirism to social mobility and to persuasive charm. A person who can move between homes and who can attach to guardianship relationships threatens the household precisely because conventional protections rely on kinship and social visibility. The archival posture of the narrative aims at legibility for posterity. Documents are compiled so that an event can be read and judged. The narrator's act of compiling is a moral gesture. It transforms confusion into a record that can be studied. The formal decision to close with documents and testimony is not merely rhetorical. It is a way of asserting that private disturbance can be handled through public procedure. That choice reflects a Victorian faith in the capacity of records to make sense of personal and social disorder. Carmilla's afterlife results from that combination of domestic immediacy and testimonial structure. The story provides a model for writers who want to combine erotic suggestion with procedural authority. Carmilla's techniques make it adaptable. Later authors and dramatists can extract scenes of intimacy, moments of deposition and clinical description to rework in different social contexts. The gendered template created by the story offers a way to represent female transgression in a culture that requires deniability or plausible alternative readings. The story also invites reflection on evidence and interpretation. The assembling of documents highlights how private facts become public artifacts. That transformation matters because social consequences attach to public records. The narrative, therefore, raises the question of how institutions, medical and legal, mediate private experience, and how those institutions participate in the making of meaning. The tension between intimate feeling and public judgment is the central problem that Carmilla stages. The tone of the narrative remains consistently calm and observant. The narrator speaks with a tone of measured grief and careful record-keeping. That tone keeps the reader in a position of sober attention rather than in a state of sensational excitement. The measured delivery makes the late disclosures more powerful because they feel earned through methodical accumulation rather than through contrived shock. Fanu structures key scenes so that small gestures carry interpretive weight. The opening of intimacy between Laura and Carmilla is delivered with particular restraint. A reader notes the placement of hands, the slanting of a glance, the quiet language around shared hours. When Carmilla sleeps near Laura and an injury is discovered upon waking, the immediate description is precise and local. The wound is not narrated as spectacle. It is recorded as fact. The narrator lists observations and dates. The narrow focus on detail turns a private injury into an item of professional concern once a physician is consulted. The medical consultation itself is described in procedural language. The doctor records symptoms, notes pallor, and recommends rest. The pragmatic register resists dramatic flourish and instead accumulates evidence that points away from ordinary illness without naming a supernatural cause. The pattern of repeated small incidents builds a persuasive case. A single event would be ambiguous. The text avoids explanation by producing a sequence. Nightly visitations, altered sleep, progressive wasting, and marked changes in temper and appetite appear across entries. Each entry is given a date. Each witness is named. The cumulative archive model framed in these dates and names converts anecdote into document. Pressed into this documentary mode, the story asks readers to weigh material in the same way an inquest would weigh testimony. That formal demand forces readers to act as interpreters of evidence rather than as consumers of spectacle. The effect is that the uncanny becomes legible only through the methodical accumulation of ordinary signs. Close reading of specific paragraphs shows how Le Fanu makes this technique subtle rather than blunt. He inserts a single scenic detail and then returns to it at a later point, allowing a repetition to acquire new meaning. a gesture first recorded as comforting becomes by repetition suspicious. A preference in diet or in sitting posture returns as a diagnostic sign. The narrator's grief and puzzlement are evident in the slant of reported speech and in the selection of items singled out for notation. The rhetorical strategy is not to tell readers what to feel, but to shape the field of attention so that certain inferences become natural. Le Fanu calibrates point of view to maintain intimate access while preserving uncertainty. The narrator speaks from a position inside the household, and yet frames the account as assembled testimony. That interior vantage produces effective proximity to the events, while the frame supplies the documentary apparatus that projects authority. The tension between intimacy and archive is central. The narrator is emotionally implicated, yet committed to making the record coherent. Readers perceive both the subjectivity of the voice and the attempt to bracket it through procedure. That dual posture is one reason the text resists simplistic moralizing. It shows feeling, and it shows the attempt to render feeling into evidence. The scene of discovery that reveals Carmilla's true name and origin introduces a historiographical turn. Material that appears extraneous at first suddenly functions as a connecting fact. A tomb inscription or a fragment of memory becomes a node that links narrative anomalies to a possible lineage. The discovery is not theatrical. It is the result of piecing together testimony and of pursuing an archival lead. The slow logic of this discovery emphasizes method over revelation. The narrative treats the past as retrievable, if only through care. That emphasis models a way of reading that privileges documentation and the triangulation of witness accounts. Responses by other characters within the story illuminate the social stakes. Guardianship, reputation, and the household's future all influence how evidence is collected and how actions are taken. A guardian calculates risk for family standing. Servants express alarm and sometimes disbelief. Medical men offer clinical assessments. Local officials or distant kin provide a context for possible intervention. The network of social roles structures responses so that action is rarely purely private. Even the decision to pursue a particular line of inquiry is made with an eye to public consequence. In Le Fanu's text, social prudence and private feeling constantly intersect. Gender dynamics are particularly significant in how evidence is interpreted. The intimate attachment between women destabilizes normative expectations about domestic roles. The text shows how maternal or guardian responsibility is reconfigured when emotional attachments fall outside accepted channels. The narrator's role as both protector and participant complicates normative responses. The household has to choose between trust and intervention. That dilemma plays out not only in relation to physical harm, but also in relation to reputation. The narrator's fear is practical as well as emotional. That practical fear shapes the narrative logic of compiling documents and seeking confirmation. Queer readings of Carmilla focus on the way affection and erotic attachment are coded through gesture, repetition, and proximity. The text does not offer explicit sexual description. Instead, it relies on the accumulation of signs that certain modern readers understand as erotic. Le Fanu's era required a rhetoric of evasion. Within those constraints, the text manages to make attachment palpable. The narrative allows for multiple interpretations simultaneously. It gives readers who seek to read erotic desire a plausible set of signs while allowing other readers to construe the same signs as intense friendship. This ambiguity is not accidental. It is a deliberate effect that both protected the text from overt censure and allowed it to function as a site of coded exchange. Contemporary reception reacted along multiple vectors. Some reviewers accepted the tale as an effective exercise in the uncanny and praised the economy of form. Others registered moral unease. Where moral anxiety appears, it often translates into commentary about domestic propriety, rather than into direct condemnation of same-sex intimacy. That rhetorical pattern shows how public discourse managed delicate matters by reframing them as issues of household vulnerability, reputation, and physical health. Critics, therefore, debated appropriate responses at the level of social effect, rather than at the level of private feeling. Le Fanu's technical choices influenced later writers. The domestic testimonial mode became a model for narratives that wanted to explore forbidden intimacies without explicit language. Authors who followed him used framed testimony, medical registers, and domestic detail to create similar effects. The figure of a charming intruder who penetrates household life by degrees provided a durable template. Female vampirism as an inversion of expected care roles emerged as a recurrent motif in later fiction. That template permitted writers to approach erotic and social anxieties in a way that remained commercially palatable and narratively compelling. Stage adaptations and popular translations of Carmilla further shaped public memory. Theatrical practitioners amplified physical gesture and spectacle, making certain traits more visible and more easily recognized by audiences. The slipperiness of textual ambiguity often gave way on stage to clearer polarization between victim and predator. That shift influenced the way future readers imagined the figure on the page. When portrayals and performance emphasized bodily peril and visible threat, later readers brought that imagined performance back to the reading of the original text. The interplay of page and stage therefore contributed to the evolution of a recognizable set of vampiric features. The tale's afterlife in print culture also matters. Carmilla circulated in reprint anthologies, in periodical compilations, and in translations. Each act of reprinting presented the story to new audiences and sometimes with different paratexts that reoriented interpretation. Editors and anthologists framed the story in ways that foregrounded particular interpretive possibilities. Inclusion in collections of Gothic or supernatural tales emphasized the uncanny, whereas inclusion in histories of sensation emphasized social scandal. That curatorial work steered readers toward various readings without altering the text itself. Le Fanu's formal emphasis on documentation and careful observation invites reflection on institutions that mediate private life. Medicine, law, and local governance all appear as mechanisms through which intimate disturbance is converted into public action. The narrative shows both the strengths and the limits of those institutions. Medical observation can identify signs but cannot always specify cause. Legal procedure can provide closure but may not repair harm. The story's archival posture is therefore a commentary on the means available in a modernizing society to manage what was once handled by rumor or by private negotiation. The psychological complexity of the narrator matters for the ethical dimension of the tale. Readers are given a voice that is at once complicit in seeking clarity. That dual position compels readers to consider how involvement colors testimony. The text thus becomes a meta-commentary on the production of evidence. It asks how trauma reshapes memory, and how memory in turn shapes public record. The narrator's attempts to be methodical disclose the difficulty of making private feeling legible within public frameworks. Carmilla's treatment of affect also opens space for exploration of sympathy. Le Fanu does not reduce the vampire to pure evil. The text invites empathy while documenting harm. That ambivalence complicates moral closure. The destruction of the vampire becomes a bitter remedy rather than a triumphant victory. The narrative allows mourning for both victim and intruder because it insists that attachment is complex and that remedies are imperfect. This moral nuance gives the text a lasting psychological depth that has appealed to readers across different historical moments. Finally, the combination of intimate focus, documentary form, and procedural closure has had a broad influence on the trajectory of vampire fiction by making transgression legible as both private feeling and public evidence. Le Fanu established a narrative technique that later authors adapted for an array of purposes, whether used to probe sexual politics, to critique social hierarchy, or to stage physiological decay as a metaphor for social disease. The technique endures. Carmilla remains a touchstone because it shows how a brief, carefully assembled narrative can handle complex, effective material without resorting to explicit naming. Read this way. Carmilla makes desire legible through small gestures, bodily signs, and testimonial report, producing a coded eroticism that demands close attention to how private feeling becomes public record, and how public record in turn shapes the politics of intimacy. Sexuality, seduction, and forbidden desire are central to how early literary vampires operate. This account focuses on the techniques authors used when explicit language was risky, and on how medical discourse, legal pressure, market incentives, and reader practices shaped the ways erotic material was presented and read. The goal is to show, in concrete terms, how vampiric fiction encoded desire without saying it outright, and how that encoding made the vampire useful as a narrative device for exploring social anxieties. Social constraints set the context. Open discussion of sexual desire was dangerous for authors and for publishers. Obscenity rules were inconsistent, libel law posed real risks, and informal social sanction could end careers. Editors and publishers therefore preferred material that avoided explicit naming of sexual acts or of same-sex desire. That constraint created a strong incentive for coded representation. Writers who wanted to work with erotic themes developed strategies that signaled without stating. The vampire motif fit those strategies because it could represent seduction, penetration, and contagion in ways that fit several rhetorical frames at once. Medical discourse supplied a practical vocabulary for coded representation. Popular medical texts, case studies, and advice columns made diagnostic language available to a broad reading public. Terms such as pallor, wasting, nervous exhaustion, and hysteria carried weight. When an author described a victim's sleepless nights, diminished appetite, or progressive weakness, the passage read in two registers. To a casual reader, it could appear as a description of illness. To a reader alert for subtext, it could indicate sexual depletion or invasive intimacy. calling in a physician inside a story was itself a rhetorical move. The presence of a medical professional allowed narrators to present symptoms as objective data, thereby converting private contact into legible public sign. The vampire figure blends seduction and disease. In narratives by Polidori and by Fanu, intimate contact results in bodily decline. That narrative economy maps emotional or erotic transgression to physical consequence. Authors used this mapping to make forbidden desire visible, while keeping explicit sexual description off the page. Writers describe the effects of contact rather than the act itself. Readers learn to translate a cluster of symptoms into an underlying erotic logic. The clinical register thus functioned as a code that made erotic transgression readable under the guise of pathology. Narrative form further enabled coded representation. Framed testimony, diaries, letters, and medical reports introduce a layer of mediation between the sexual act and public knowledge. First-person testimony offers access to interior feeling, while framed documents give the appearance of documentary authority. These forms also provide plausible deniability. A narrator who compiles testimony claims to be recording facts rather than inventing erotic spectacle. Readers who look for transgressive content can read the same documents as evidence of erotic attachment. The combination of close interior voice and archival framing made implication especially effective. Polidori and Fanu use these devices in distinct ways while exploiting shared cultural affordances. Polidori places vampiric action in aristocratic social spaces. His figure is a polished intruder who uses charm and status to gain access. The danger he presents is social as much as moral. Polidori emphasizes manners and inheritance to frame sexual impropriety as a threat to social order. His clinical details invite diagnostic readings that link intimacy with pathology. The result is a tale that discusses sexual impropriety through the lens of social consequence, rather than through explicit erotic depiction. Fanu's approach in Carmilla centers domestic intimacy between women. The story compiles testimony, dates, and medical observations into a coherent dossier. Fanu's concentrates on gestures, proximity, and small rituals of care. A hand placed in sleep, a preference for close company, or a leaning glance acquire interpretive force through repetition. The physician is invited into the household, and the medical notes are incorporated into the archive. That procedure reframes devotion as a social and medical problem that requires intervention. The story, therefore, allows readers to experience erotic charge while maintaining a narrative stance that frames the matter as health and reputation rather than as explicit eroticism. Coding operates at the micro level. Authors emphasize repeated interactions and prolonged proximity to suggest erotic meaning. A detail that might mean little in isolation becomes significant by repetition. In Carmilla, a shared pillow, a lingering embrace, or the exchange of private confidences accumulate until they function as indexes of an attachment that crosses conventional boundaries. In the Vampyre, small acts of intimacy combined with social penetration signal an exploitative form of desire. The strategy is deliberately ambiguous. It allows readers seeking erotic content to see it without forcing a single interpretive frame on all readers. Pathologizing moves had particular social implications. Describing desire as a symptom permitted a range of rhetorical outcomes. Medical language made female distress visible in a culture that often discounted female testimony. At the same time, pathologizing female desire could be used to dismiss that desire as illness. Authors could therefore both highlight female suffering and rely on a medical frame that reduced autonomous female sexuality to a clinical category. That double-edged effect reflects the complex social position of women in the 19th century and explains why authors sometimes use pathology to both condemn and to vindicate. Queer readings exploit the slipperiness of coded representation. Because direct mention of same-sex desire was risky, the rhetoric of gesture and intensity enabled contemporary queer readers to recognize erotic content. Later readers with different vocabularies can also retrieve erotic meaning from the same signs. In scholarly readings, the vampire becomes a useful metaphor for forbidden desire, a way of articulating how interest is socially policed. The encoded erotic energy shows up in exchanges of breath, in physical closeness, and in the dynamics of gift and response. Those features allowed texts like Carmilla to function as sites of queer identification long before modern identity categories existed. Market incentives reinforced coded strategies. Publishers wanted sensational material that would sell without provoking legal or social backlash. Editorial choices were shaped by cost-benefit calculations. Ambiguity offered commercial advantage. A text that could be read as medical case study, moral parable, or uncanny report had broader appeal. Editors and anthologists favored items that could circulate in multiple venues. The vampire story, with its blend of sensation and plausible deniability, fit that need. The result was a commercial ecology that encouraged the production and reprinting of stories designed to be read in multiple ways. Reader practices were central to the system. Sophisticated readers learned to decode formal cues. Framed testimony signaled documentary intent. Medical description signaled plausible causation. Repetition signaled emphasis. These shared interpretive habits allowed writers to compress erotic meaning into compact forms. Readers who desired more explicit material could derive that satisfaction by learning the code. The social competence of readers thus co-determined what authors could represent on the page. Writers relied on a community of readers capable of reading between lines without the text ever needing to spell out what it meant. Censorship operated through a mix of formal and informal mechanisms. Formal censorship was only part of the constraint. Editors could refuse submissions, reviewers could shame authors, and social networks could withdraw patronage. Those mechanisms produced diffuse pressure that shaped authorial strategy. Choosing coded representation reduced the risk of explicit liability. The vampire motif provided a rhetorical space that allowed transgressive subjects to be explored safely. The motif also eased adaptation to stage and later media, where spectacle could be amplified or attenuated depending on audience expectations. Close reading reveals how these strategies work in detail. A passage that notes a character's sleep disturbance, the frequency of nocturnal visits, or a pallid complexion functions cumulatively. A hand touching a wrist, a reluctance to speak of certain hours, or a preference for private conversation are small, formal moves that together indicate intimate attachment. A doctor's note scheduling rest serves as institutional corroboration. The architecture of such scenes requires readers to infer motive and to assemble scattered data into a coherent narrative. The narrative thus transforms intimacy into a form of evidence. The stakes of coded representation include more than moral judgment. Reputation, economic security, and family prospects are also at risk. In a society where marriage determined economic futures, a scandal could be ruinous. Authors, therefore, depict seduction as a form of social harm to justify investigation and remedy. The vampire amplifies that logic by embodying predation enacted through social advantage. The monster is both erotic figure and social threat. This duality made the vampire useful for narratives that wish to justify intervention on practical grounds. Scholars have debated the balance between authorial intention and reader projection. The evidence points to a mutual shaping. Writers intentionally used devices that encouraged coded readings. Readers brought interpretive habits shaped by cultural vocabularies, including medicine, law, and household norms. The interaction between authorial technique and reader competence produced the vampire as an intelligible index of forbidden desire. The longer-term effect is substantial. Encoding erotic transgression through clinical registers and testimonial framing became a recurring strategy in Gothic and sensation fiction. It enabled authors to tackle taboo subjects while preserving market viability. Over time, the practice established a literary logic where desire is often presented as damage and where intimacy is narrated as potential threat. This logic influenced later vampire fiction and wider cultural narratives about sexuality and power. To conclude, the coded strategies of medicalization, testimonial framing, gesture and repetition, and market-oriented ambiguity together formed a robust method for representing forbidden desire. The vampire emerged as a productive tool within that method because it could signify seduction and harm without explicit naming. Understanding these techniques clarifies not only how early vampire narratives functioned, but also why they've remained adaptable to different social moments and to evolving media. Letters, diaries, and framed memoirs play a decisive role in late 18th and 19th century fiction because those forms create a particular kind of intimacy and authority at once. They place readers close to interior life while also offering a cover of documentary distance. The combination is practical and powerful. An epistolary detail feels private. A journal entry feels immediate. At the same time, the language of record-keeping suggests that what is presented has passed a threshold into shared knowledge. That threshold is the point where a private feeling becomes material that readers can inspect and argue about. The basic mechanics are straightforward. A letter addresses another person. A diary entry addresses the self and later readers. A framed memoir offers a set of documents arranged by an editor or narrator. Each mode does two things. First, it limits perspective. The reader learns only what a writer of letters or journals notices. That narrowing creates urgency and immersion because the reader is placed inside a particular consciousness. Second, it claims provenance. The narrative posture appeals to trace and to origin. The text exists as a recovered thing that stands for a past moment. That appeal to provenance matters in cultures that prize documentary proof. Close intimacy follows from both constraints. When a narrator writes as if to a friend or to themselves, the language is often less performative and more confessional. Writers working in these modes rely on modest, concrete detail. The small physical moments matter. A hand on a pillow, a short exchange, a hesitated phrase in a letter become the units of evidence that build meaning. Because the material is presented as private, the writer feels implicated. The effect is a shared attention that can feel disquieting when the private content concerns desire or transgression. Framing devices do work that direct narration cannot. A framed memoir allows conflicting voices to appear. It can juxtapose a diary entry with a contemporaneous letter and with a later deposition. Those juxtapositions create the conditions for interpretive work. Readers compare versions. They notice where memories diverge. That comparative reading makes the fact of contradiction itself a kind of evidence. The frame turns unreliability from a weakness into a feature. It makes uncertainty legible. In tales where intimacy itself is the source of danger, the quality is valuable. The reader learns to triangulate meaning from fragments, rather than to accept a single authoritative account. Authors use the archive tactic to produce plausibility. Presenting material as found documents invites a reading stance that is different from pure fiction. The claim that documents exist gives the narrative an evidentiary posture. For audiences accustomed to legal depositions, medical notes, and police records that posture matters, it suggests a method of verification. It also supplies cover. By couching erotic content in documentary frames, a writer can offer the hint of sexual meaning while avoiding explicit description. The archive is a buffer that permits implication without declaration. Materiality plays into credibility. When a text presents a dated letter, a seal, or a signature, it gestures toward an object outside the text. Even a textual cue, such as a dateline, offers the illusion of physicality. Readers who frequent periodicals and who know the look of real letters respond to those cues with a level of suspension that is different from what they offer to omniscient narration. The rhetorical currency of physical documentary detail matters in cultures where paper records have legal and social force. Epistolary and journal forms also shape rhythm and tempo. Short dated entries compress time. The narrative can move in sudden leaps or in cumulative accretion. Date markers divide attention into episodes and force readers to experience the slow build of repeated small moments. That pacing is especially useful when the aim is to show the incremental development of an intimacy that becomes suspect. An entry that seems unremarkable on day one becomes ominous when it is read alongside an entry from a later week. The serial accumulation invites the kind of forensic reading that turns habit into pattern. At the same time, these forms complicate authority. Private writing is not neutral witness. A diary is an instrument of memory shaped by emotion. A letter is rhetorical and instrumental. Many letters aim to persuade, console, or charm. That rhetorical element introduces the possibility of self-presentation and of strategic omission. Skilled authors exploit that instability. They make the apparent candidness of a journal a site of rhetorical operation. Readers who notice the slant of testimony become active participants. The task of writing shifts from passive reception to active interpretation. In the context of forbidden desire, the effects are sharper. Private writing allows intimacies to be described in ways that feel intimate and credible without explicit sexual language. The grammar of confession invites a kind of believability. Readers who are alert to intimacies learn to read minimized gestures as signals. When the same gestures repeat across multiple private documents, the weight of inference grows. The epistolary archive turns the reader into a juror piecing together motive from multiple small facts. Framing devices also alter the social distribution of authority. An editor who presents documents claims interpretive control by way of selection and ordering. The very act of compiling an archive imposes a narrative logic. Selections include some materials and omit others. That editorial curation shapes what counts as evidence. In tales that want to interrogate propriety, editors in the text often present their work as neutral, even as their choices tilt how the reader will judge. Readers learn to be suspicious of the compiler, even as they rely on the compiled record to make sense of events. The use of letters and journals also provides strategies for circumventing formal censorship. A letter that reports an attachment in restrained factual language can be read by a perceptive reader as intimate. Because the text leaves the erotic in inferential space, it avoids direct accusation. The document format provides plausible deniability for both author and reader. In markets where publishers feared libel or community reprisal, that deniability was valuable commercial capital. It allowed stories to circulate in respectable formats while carrying subtexts that addressed forbidden topics. Narrative voice in these forms often privileges a measured observational tone, even when the content is emotionally charged. That tonal restraint is part of why such writing reads as credible. When emotional intensity is manifested through repetition and through attention to small domestic detail rather than through rhetorical excess, the reader experiences a different kind of affective pressure. The slow, steady presentation of facts makes the eventual revelation feel earned rather than sensational. That route is particularly effective when the text seeks to represent the shock of transgression as rooted in the quotidian rather than in spectacle. Letters and diaries also participate in gendered scripts. For women, private writing historically provided a sanctioned space for reflection and emotional record. That convention made journals a plausible repository for intense attachments that public discourse would otherwise suppress. Authors could therefore present female intimacy as private record in a way that read as credible to contemporary readers. That strategy allowed writers to show how same-sex attachment could develop under the radar of social surveillance, while also explaining why it eventually becomes public concern when symptoms appear and reputation is at stake. The intimacy created by these forms also produces complicity. Readers who follow a string of private notes participate in a covert relation with the narrator. They are invited to be confidants. That effective complicity increases the force of horror when intimacy becomes danger because the reader has by then invested emotionally in the relationship. The form, therefore, does double work. It generates sympathy for the narrator, and it sets the stage for moral and practical dilemmas when that intimacy harms social stability. Technically, the epistolary archive supports mise en abyme of testimony. A letter includes quoted speech. A diary contains remembered conversations. A framed memoir may reproduce official documents. That nesting of texts creates a complex mirror effect where each layer comments on the other. The technique trains readers to notice nuance in reported speech and to weigh discrepancies. The multiplicity of textual layers mirrors the multiplicity of perspectives that characterize real social life. Authors who wish to dramatize the difficulty of ascertaining motive find the archive form ideal. Consider how these forms mediate later adaptation. When a tale built from letters and journals moves to stage or to film, adapters must decide whether to preserve the document frame or to externalize it. Stage adaptations often convert a private letter into a public reading or confession on stage, thereby changing the relation between narrator and audience. Film adaptations can use voiceover to mimic diary intimacy, or can show the physical document as a prop. Those choices affect the balance between closeness and evidentiary distance. The archival frame, therefore, remains a central technical problem for any retelling that wishes to preserve the specific kind of intimacy that epistolary forms produce. Publishers, editors, and the periodical market did more than move stories from author to reader. They set practical limits on what could be printed and on how material about desire or scandal would be framed. By the mid-19th century, magazines depended on subscribers, advertising revenue, and the goodwill of local opinion leaders. Those economic ties made editorial judgment a form of risk management. Editors weighed legal exposure, advertiser reaction, and reader sensibility before they accepted or promoted a piece. Law and custom shaped that judgment. Libel law and obscenity concerns were tangible constraints. Even if courts did not intervene often, the threat of a costly suit or of organized protest made publishers cautious. Editors learned common practices to reduce risk. They anonymized details, changed names, and required documentary framing for sensitive material. Presenting a tale as a medical case, as recovered correspondence, or as a historical anecdote often diffused immediate legal danger. Those tactical choices became standard editorial tools. Self-censorship was routine inside editorial rooms. Submissions were evaluated not only for literary quality, but also for likely reception among subscribers and patrons. Material that risked alienating advertisers, clergy, or civic leaders was trimmed, delayed, or refused. That process shaped what authors attempted. Writers, aiming to publish transgressive content, adopted forms that fit the room's expectations. Frame testimony, clinical description, and euphemism served both author and editor by keeping surfaces defensible while allowing dense subtext for attentive readers. Market incentives favored ambiguity. Sensation and scandal sold, but overt accusation could destroy a title. The commercially smart compromise was material that suggested strongly enough to excite readers, but remained deniable on demand. Short, portable tales that could be reprinted across different outlets had extra value. An item that worked as both uncanny fiction and as medical curiosity could be repackaged for anthologies and reviews. Editors favored stories with that kind of flexibility because reprintability increased profit and reduce the marginal cost of acquisition. Paratext and placement mattered. A headnote, a prefatory remark, or the section of the magazine where a story appeared signaled to readers how to interpret it. An editor could defuse scandal by presenting a tale as a cautionary example or as an illustration of medical oddity. Conversely, suggesting a topical link or a celebrity connection could boost attention. Small curatorial moves, therefore, had disproportionate influence on reception. Authors who negotiated favorable paratext with editors often secured wider and safer circulation than those who did not. Reprint networks amplified initial editorial choices. A story that first appeared in a cautious context might be excerpted, summarized, or anthologized in other venues where framing changed. When material moved between titles, its interpretive frame sometimes hardened into a single dominant reading. Early corrections or disclaimers could be lost in the reprint flow. That reality made first publication choices consequential, because reprint could entrench an interpretation before authorial clarifications took effect. Anthologies and collections functioned as secondary editors. The curator's choices about which stories to gather and how to sequence them guided readers toward particular readings. A tale placed in a collection of supernatural stories would be read differently from the same tale published in a volume of medical curiosities. Publishers used anthologies to resell existing material to new markets and to shape the afterlife of pieces by associating them with particular themes. Theater created a parallel circuit of interpretation. Stage adaptation required clearer visual and moral signals than many framed narratives provided. Adapters generally amplified character motivation and bodily peril to suit audience expectations. That process often reduced textual ambiguity and made sexual or moral threat more explicit. Performances then fed back into reading practices because audiences brought theatrical memory to later encounters with the printed text. The interplay between stage and page therefore remodeled public understanding of many stories. Economic precarity among writers was a shaping force. Many authors depended on quick sales and repeat commissions. Short, marketable tales that editors could reprint provided steady income. That pressure favored compact plots, portable character types, and forms that facilitated adaptation. Writers who needed money learned to write to editorial tastes and to anticipate paratextual reframing. Commercial imperatives thus had a direct formal impact on literary production. Informal censorship mattered as much as law. Clergy, civic groups, and local notables could organize against a title, pressure advertisers, or shame contributors. Editors, attentive to local markets, adjusted content accordingly. The segmented nature of readership meant that some venues could risk more explicit material while others remained conservative. That uneven geography of tolerance produced a range of editorial climates and strategies for encoding sensitive subjects. Taken together, these forces produced a resilient editorial ecology. Framed testimony, clinical registers, and strategic omission were not merely stylistic choices. They were tools for surviving and for profiting in a market that rewarded sensation but punished perceived excess. The publishing environment, therefore, shaped both what authors could say about desire and how readers learned to find meaning in suggestion. The vampire story thrived inside that ecology because it could deliver charge and threat while remaining formally defensible and commercially adaptable. The figure of the female vampire concentrates a set of gendered anxieties that circulated in 19th century culture. When the vampire is cast as woman, she becomes a shorthand for fears about sexual agency, maternal roles, and the permeability of domestic space. This section examines how texts like Carmilla and other 19th century tales use the female vampire as a metaphor for social disorder, how those metaphors intersect with ideas about class and respectability, and how the gendered vampire reshapes expectations about the household and about feminine behavior. Start from how the domestic frame turns women into both protectors and sources of vulnerability. The 19th century household is portrayed as a site of moral formation and social reproduction. Women are expected to manage private life, to guard reputation, and to secure futures through marriage and kin ties. A female vampire transgresses that role by using intimacy as a means of intrusion. The problem for narrators and readers is not merely erotic, it is functional. A woman who, instead of preserving kin ties, undermines them becomes a figure of practical threat, because family stability and inheritance depend on predictable attachments. The inversion of maternal and caregiving expectations is a central motif. Vampire women may appear in the role of companion, nurse, or ward. Their apparent care gives access to bodies and to trust. That access is what makes the figure dangerous for narratives concerned with social order. The text often emphasizes how the figure exploits trust, how small gestures of care become vectors for harm, and how domestic routines are weaponized. These elements make the vampire intelligible as a gendered threat because they map onto cultural anxieties about women who step outside prescribed roles or who exercise influence in ways that escape male oversight. Class registers matter. The female vampire is often figured as a social interloper who crosses class boundaries, a visitor of uncertain origin, a companion without clear kin ties, or a woman of ambiguous social standing destabilizes household hierarchies. That instability is narratively useful because it draws attention to the limits of social surveillance. Stories use class markers to make intrusions plausible. A polished manner with no accountable background invites suspicion. A character who can move between drawing rooms and private chambers without a traceable social anchor embodies the anxiety that modern mobility and changing labor arrangements introduced into domestic life. Descriptions of female allure operate differently from male vampiric portraits. Female vampirism in these texts is frequently coded through intimacy, sustained presence, and aesthetic charm rather than through predatory spectacle. That difference produces a particular rhetorical effect. Readers are invited to read encounters as prolonged exchange rather than a sudden attack. The language used to depict female seduction centers on gestures, on looks, and on lingering care. The narrative asks readers to question how acceptable forms of affection can be reinscribed as dangerous when they fall outside normative channels. The cultural scripts for female sexuality complicate interpretation. In many 19th century discourses, female desire is already treated as suspect or as subordinate to male authority. The female vampire magnifies that pre-existing unease by literalizing fears about women who exert sexual influence. Texts that focus on female vampirism can therefore function conservatively by warning against female transgression. They can also function subversively by granting the female figure power and agency in a cultural moment that denies it. The ambiguity allows different audiences to read the same figure as cautionary or as a rare depiction of female potency. Religious and moral language shapes the reception of female vampirism, too. Critics and readers often interpret female vampiric acts through metaphors of sin, contamination, and failed duty. The moral vocabulary supplies a template for public response, concern for the household, for the moral education of young women, and for the need to restore proper order. That rhetoric serves practical ends because it justifies intervention and because it aligns with institutional priorities that manage female behavior through schooling, charity, and marriage markets. Medical discourse intersects with gendered metaphors in a specific way. The pathologizing of female pleasure or of non-normative attachment makes clinical descriptions available as tools for authors and readers. Terms like hysteria, nervous exhaustion, or wasting provide plausible registers for narrators to describe decline without naming erotic cause. Medicalization can be employed to condemn or dehumanize. It supplies a method by which narrators can treat a victim's decline as observable fact while leaving motive inferential. The clinical frame, therefore, mediates moral judgment and social intervention in gender terms. Performance and visual culture amplify gender tropes. Stage versions of female vampire stories often heightened erotic display or clarified motive in ways that print left ambiguous. Costuming, gesture, and proximity on stage made female allure visible in ways that intensified the perceived threat. Visual representation in illustrations and in later film adaptations similarly fixed certain traits. Languid poise, focused gaze, and ambiguous smile that became shorthand for female vampiric danger. The circulation of those visual tropes fed back into reading practices and helped stabilize a gendered iconography. Resistance and ambivalence appear in the texts as well. Not every narrative treats the female vampire as a simple emblem of moral collapse. Some writers complicate the category by exploring sympathy, by questioning the fairness of moral reprisal, or by showing how social constraint produces the very conditions for dangerous attachment. In these readings, the vampire can be a mirror of social failure, an embodiment of unmet need, or a figure who exposes the limits of domestic governance. The gendered vampire, therefore, operates on multiple levels. It is a plot device that dramatizes household vulnerability. It is a cultural symbol that encodes anxieties about female autonomy and class mobility. It is a rhetorical instrument that allows authors to stage erotic threat without explicit naming. And it is a site of contested meaning where conservative and critical readings coexist. Understanding the female vampire requires attending to all these registers simultaneously rather than collapsing the figure into a single moral lesson. Stage, page, and screen carry the early vampire figures into wider cultural life. The shift from magazine item to public spectacle helped fix traits and motifs that later writers and producers reused. Adaptation worked in two directions. Theatrical versions amplified visible peril and gesture, and print versions absorbed performance memory. Film and later visual media made certain attributes durable by giving them repeatable images and movement. Early theater adaptations found in short vampire tales compact plots that could be expanded for performance. Managers looked for clear conflict, a striking antagonist, and situations that could be staged for effect. Theatrical versions often simplified ambiguous text by clarifying motive and by making the threat bodily and immediate. That simplification suited an audience in a theater where visual clarity mattered more than documentary subtlety. Costuming and staging turned mannered charm into recognizable menace and made intimate threat legible to a crowd. Print culture responded. Reprints and anthologies circulated theatricalized versions alongside original texts. Readers who saw stage productions brought those images back to later readings. Editors sometimes emphasized stage provenance in paratext to boost sales. The loop between stage and page therefore shaped how the vampire was remembered. Certain gestures, postures, and scenarios became standard because they worked in performance and because print reprinting preserved those choices. Early cinema accelerated this process. Filmmakers borrowed theatrical conventions and introduced new visual grammar. Close-ups, pacing, and montage allowed for emphasis on faces and on small gestures in ways that stage could only hint at. Film also democratized the vampire image by reaching audiences who did not read periodicals. The cinematic vampire inherited traits from both print and stage, and then contributed new conventions, such as pronounced physical transformation, emphatic eye contact, and stylized movement. Genre consolidation followed. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a familiar set of traits had emerged: nocturnal visitation, intimate proximity, social mobility or disguise, and a link between intimacy and bodily decline. These traits were not universal, but they became common enough to be recognizable. Later, writers repurposed them in different ideological registers: moral caution, erotic exploration, social critique, or pure spectacle. The female vampire in particular became a recurring archetype in adaptation. Stage and screen emphasized visual markers of femininity and used them to heighten erotic tension. Costume, makeup, and choreography amplified the suggestive aspects that print had only implied. In some adaptations, the female figure was sexualized overtly. In others, the figure was made monstrous in ways that underline danger rather than desire. The variability of treatment shows how adaptable the figure was to market and moral demands. Adaptation also involved translation across national and cultural contexts. Continental theater and cinema imported English and Irish texts and reshaped them according to local tastes and censorship regimes. Sometimes the vampire was secularized, sometimes religious frames were emphasized, and sometimes national anxieties about modernity or migration were projected onto the figure. The model of an intimate intruder proved flexible for different societies that wanted a symbolic container for multiple fears. Scholars and critics played a role in shaping legacy by anthologizing and historicizing early texts. Critical editions, literary histories, and scholarly essays rescued some neglected pieces and situated them within broader traditions. That work influenced which texts remained visible to later writers and how those writers read the early models. Critical framing sometimes emphasized lineage, making a case for direct influence, and sometimes highlighted independent convergences across cultures. Commercial pressures continued to guide adaptation choices. Producers aimed for recognizability. They chose elements likely to attract audiences: suspense, erotic charge, and clear stakes. Those choices favored certain narrative moves and discouraged others. As a result, some of the more subtle techniques of testimonial framing and archival ambiguity were lost in popular memory, even as their influence persisted in tone and structure. The long cultural life of early vampire texts shows how a literary motif can move from salon anecdote to a durable multimedia archetype. The movement depended on practical choices by editors, adapters, and producers. It also depended on audiences learning to recognize and expect certain features. The legacy of Polidori and Fanu is therefore not a single unbroken line. but a set of recurrent options that later creators could select, combine, and modify. These early vampire stories show how private life can shape the direction of a tale without turning it into a grand statement. The materials behind them, the notes and letters and everyday writing habits, sit quietly in the background. They belong to the homes and workrooms where these authors lived, not as symbols, but as the ordinary tools people used to keep track of thoughts and small events. When critics or readers later examined those traces, the meaning often came from the steady patterns of life rather than any dramatic moment. Polidori's world and Lefena's world were filled with slow routines, long conversations, and the kind of small tensions that grow in familiar spaces. Their stories reflect that pace. Danger appears through changes in tone and behavior rather than through spectacle. A character grows distant. A visitor stays too long. A conversation shifts in a way that feels slightly off. The pressure builds from these simple movements, creating a form of unease that grows naturally out of daily life. What lingers from these works is the sense that forbidden closeness often develops quietly. It does not need elaborate explanation. It moves through schedules, shared rooms, and the ordinary time between meals or errands. These stories treat that quiet movement as enough. They show how the smallest shift in routine can unsettle an entire household, how a change in trust can reshape the air around people who thought they understood one another. By the time the stories reach their final moments, nothing grand is required. The atmosphere holds the weight. The reader can feel how a private attachment has stretched beyond its limits, how the balance in a home no longer fits the patterns that once kept it steady. The ending rests on that simple recognition. It suggests that the real power of these early vampire tales comes from their attention to ordinary life and to the way a single change within that life can alter everything around it.